Hi everybody, I'm Alicia Ridson, and I'd like to welcome you all here tonight on behalf of the New Museum. Massimiliano Gioni, our artistic director at the New Museum, had hoped he could be here tonight, but unfortunately can't be here. He has a long-standing interest in outsider art practices, and this has consistently shaped the exhibitions that he's curated, both at this institution and elsewhere. So you might think of, for example, his Venice Biennale, the Encyclopedic Palace. You might also have seen The Keeper, which happened here recently. And then there's also other monographic exhibitions of artists whose practices kind of volley between outsider art practices and what we might think of as more straightforward contemporary art practices. And artists that he has focused on or that we've had here at the museum include Rosemary Trockle, Jim Shaw, and upcoming we have Raymond Pettibon. So it's a real pleasure to have everyone here today on account of our shared and overlapping interests and contexts in the art world. I hope you all enjoy the program, and I'll hand over now to Andrew. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Hi everybody, welcome. My name's Andrew Edlin. I'm the owner of the Outsider Art Fair, and we're really excited to be doing our OAF talk this year at the New Museum. I think this is a fantastic institution, and I really admire how their exhibitions transcend any art world categories. So tonight I feel like I have a lot of friends here on the panel, so I just wanted to, before Chris Wiley, our moderator, formally introduces them, I just wanted to say quickly that we have Karen Patterson, who is a curator from the John Michael Kohler Art Center. I don't know if you've been there. It's in Wisconsin. It's not exactly around the corner, but it's really within reach if you're in Chicago or Milwaukee. It's worth going to if you're not in Chicago or Milwaukee, but it's a great place, and I encourage everybody to pay attention to it and see what their programs are and get out there. Marion Harris, who's sitting next to Karen, is an old friend of mine who is a dealer in outsider art. None of us would have heard or seen of Morton Bartlett if were it not for Marion. On a personal note, I think I bought my first piece of outsider art from her at the Outsider Art Fair in 1995. And then next to Marion is Tom DiMaria, who is the director of the Creative Growth Art Center. Judith Scott will be the subject of his discussion today, but there are countless artists that have come out of Creative Growth, and I think it's particularly notable the way Tom has navigated the art world, not just the outsider art world, but shown how important the artists that come out of Creative Growth are in the contemporary art world in any context. So we're really happy to have him here. He's a great friend of mine. And Chris Wiley's back to moderate our panel just because he did such a great job last year, and he's such an expert in the field. Now I'll give a little more formal introduction of Chris. He's an artist, writer, and curator, and his essays have been in numerous exhibition catalogs, including Kaleidoscope, Moose, and Frieze, where he's a contributing editor. His artwork has appeared in exhibitions at PS1, and Hauser and Wirth, and Nickel Beauchesne Gallery, and he's curated some great shows in the last few years. One, a Eugene von Bruckenheim show at Macaron, and recently a show at Marianne Boski that featured Thornton Dial. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and thanks very much, and come to the Outsider Art Fair tomorrow. We were setting up all day, and it's going to be fantastic. Thanks a lot. Welcome, Chris Wiley.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Sorry to keep you all waiting. There was a little bit of a confusion with the times. So we'll just sort of jump very quickly into introducing everybody formally, and then each panelist is going to give a quick presentation on either one or two artists, and then we're going to have a little discussion, and then open it up for questions. So Karen Patterson joined the John Michael Kohler Arts Center staff in May of 2012 to continue the scholarship surrounding the institution's extensive collection of self-taught art and environmental builders. Patterson holds a master's from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where her academic studies focus on the collection of the former SAIC professor Ray Yoshida. She previously earned a bachelor's of arts in folklore and French at the Memorial University of Newfoundland. and developed and implemented heritage and public arts foundations for the city of Halifax in Nova Scotia. While at SAIC, her interest in the intersection of history and contemporary art was furthered through the studying of leveling of hierarchies between academic and self-taught art, represented in the home collection of artist Roger Brown and later in Yoshida's home collection. Marion Harris has been a dealer of art and antiques for nearly 30 years. She discovered the work of Morton Bartlett in 1993 and purchased it in its entirety. Since then, Bartlett's work has been shown in museums and galleries around the world and has been purchased for the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museum of Everything. Most recently, Bartlett's work has been featured in the Encyclopedic Palace at the 55th Venice Biennale and the Alternative Guide to the Universe at the Hayward Gallery in London. Tom DeMaria has served as the director of the Creative Growth Art Center in Oakland, California since 2000. And he speaks around the world about the center's major artists and their relationship to both outsider art and contemporary culture. Prior to this position, he served as the assistant director of the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive at UC Berkeley. Tom has also worked as the executive director of GLAAD in San Francisco and as the director of the San Francisco International Lesbian and Gay Film Festival. He holds a BFA from Rochester Institute of Technology and an MFA from Maryland Institute College of Art in film and photography. Tom is also an award-winning filmmaker with short film awards from Sundance, Black Maria, Sinking Creek, National Educational Media, and New York Experimental Film Festival. So welcome everybody, and thank you so much for talking with me today. And thank you everybody for coming. First we're gonna start with Karen Patterson, who's gonna talk about Eugene von Bernschenheim.
Okay. Hi everyone. 5 minutes about Eugene von Bernschenheim feels a little bit like speed dating. I'm not sure if I can do that, but I'm also aware that since, as Chris said, I've been here at the John Michael Kohler Arts Center since 2012, so I'm aware that I stand on the shoulders of giants who may know this work as well, if not better than I do, so including people in the room today. So here's 5 minutes about Eugene von Bernschenheim. This photo was taken just a month ago. It is our collection storage at the John Michael Kohler Art Center, and despite this photo, the Art Center never intended to be a collecting institution, and there are some pivotal moments that defined us, and one of them being Eugene von Bernschenheim. But in 1976, Ruth Kohler was invited to the Northwoods of Wisconsin and saw the site of Fred Smith, the Wisconsin Concrete Park, and initiated a restoration project with the Wisconsin Art Board to restore that site and gift it to the Price County community. And from then on in, we started working with the Kohler Foundation in collecting components from art environments that couldn't be saved in situ. And I say that because that's kind of the context in which we understand Eugene von Bernschenheim at the Kohler Art Center. As you can see, those who know, you might see some Neck Chan pieces. There's a Fred Smith deer on your left-hand side. There's some Nick Engelbert paintings and some Eugene von Bernschenheim paintings as well. So, Eugene von Bernschenheim, born in 1910 in Marinette, Wisconsin. When he was 7 years old, his mother passed away, and his father remarried to a woman who became a pivotal character to Eugene, known as Bessie. She was kind of an innovator and spoke beyond the confines of the everyday life and invention, wrote a lot, and this to Eugene was laying the groundwork of how he saw the world as well. He graduated in 1917 and quickly became a florist at a flower shop in Milwaukee, and you'll see some clues of that experience later on. And then he met Marie, who was then, when they met in 1939, named Evelyn. He renamed her to Marie after they were married, named after one of his favorite aunts. His father then gave them his small house in Milwaukee. He became a baker after a florist, and then worked as a baker until 1950 when he resigned. But really, we know him as an experimenter and an inventor and living beyond the reality of his existence in his home. A painter, thinking about the cosmos, thinking about the world, thinking about his place as an artist, an exceptional artist in the world. He was born in 1910, like I said, the same year as the Halley's Comet circulated the world, so he really felt that he was a magical creature and a magical person who had exceptional talents. I don't think we disagree. He also felt with the name von Bruckenhain that he was descendant of royalty, so he made these smaller thrones made of poultry bones. He also, every artist needs a muse, and he took thousands of photos of his wife, Marie, staged in their home and developed in their bathroom. He sourced clay from the Wisconsin State Fair. There's a construction site, and he got the clay from there and fired in his home, and again, crowns signifying his royal lineage. These, another evidence of his interest in botanical. He also was an inventor, and these are some drawings and some sketches of this kind of logical understanding of his world. He also, Marie and he used to drive around the weekends to look for arrowheads throughout Wisconsin, but then also chipped away at his own glass arrowheads. Bone tower paintings, this idea of utopia, this idea of where his royal kingdom is. And then, of course, the bone towers that we all know and love, this idea of possibility, the idea of living beyond what the existence actually is in their world. And their world is this home in Milwaukee, and this is where it kind of gets exciting because no one would know about this work. Of course, this is a beautifully colored home, but were it not for champions that we all know and love in this field who were there at the right time in the right place, we would not know about Eugene's work. And in this case, it was a police officer by the name of Dan Nitsch who was patrolling the area and saw Eugene working outside, working at night. And then slowly but surely, Eugene invited him into his home, and they became friends until Eugene passed away in 1983. And Dan believed in Eugene's work, and on a pivotal day in 1983, he brought just one piece, so I understand, of Eugene's work to the Milwaukee Art Museum. They had this free day where you could bring your artwork to get appraised by curators at the museum, and Dan brought one of Eugene's, I think bone thrones, but I've also heard paintings, I'm not quite sure. And the curator of education at that time brought the work to the director, Russell Bowman. Russell Bowman called Ruth Kohler because of her history with the Fred Smith Concrete Park, that she was always someone in the state that looked beyond the vetted world of the art world, and that she might be interested, and she was. And Russell and Ruth went to the home and were encountered with this famous sign that those of you who know the work are familiar with, this sign that I wanted to read to you because it's important to know how Eugene saw himself. Eugene von Bruckenhain, freelance artist, poet, sculptor, innovator, arrow maker, plant man, bone artifact constructor, photographer, architect, and I think that's important that he put it on over his doorway. Like, I know who I am and I know what I'm good at, in my opinion. But that didn't prepare, even still, to what Ruth and Russell and the curator at the time, Joanne Cubbs, would encounter. An entire home with all the walls painted, sculptures everywhere, and in every corner of the room, from what I understand. Marie was in the house when Ruth and Russell and Joanne went into the home, and they, from all accounts, were just, of course, blown away. You don't have any precedent to understand what this might feel like for the first time. Inside and out, concrete sculptures, chairs hanging on the outside. So then, as museum professionals, how do you turn this home into a museum? How do you take works from a home and turn them into a museum understanding? And at that time, Ruth and the Kohler staff brought the entire work from the home to Kohler to be inventoried, cleaned, and documented. And that was actually done by our registrars and volunteers in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, who were all trained on some of the skills of conserving and cleaning bone towers and painting, because there was so much soot from the furnace. And at that point, it was decided that because Marie was still alive, that the Art Center would then acquire and purchase a representative amount of Eugene's collection to give to the family so they could enable setting up an estate to care for Marie, and also have a representative amount of Eugene's work in a museum collection. But thank God for Joanne and Ruth that also thought about taking some context and some understanding, because this was an unknown artist at the time. So his photo albums, his sketches, his poetry, paintbrushes, boxes, this is a wall from where he did his work, where his thoughts are recorded, that were all in our collection and available to us to understand more about the artist. The first exhibition, of course, was in 1984 with Obsessive Visionary. It traveled from Sheboygan to Milwaukee, which is now kind of funny to think about when it's only an hour away, but it still was a traveling exhibition. And then in 1999, we did an exhibition in which we contextualized Eugene as, in a regional way, Wisconsin artists. So you see Fred Smith's deer in the background as well. And then, of course, the pivotal exhibition by Leslie Umberger in 2007, Sublime Spaces and Visionary Worlds, in which she reinforced that relationship between art making and place. So now what? So now it's our 50th anniversary at the Art Center, and we continue to think about Eugene. He's had shows all over the world. Many published catalogs, and so how does the Art Center still talk about the work and do something beyond all the good work that's happening already? So we return to the sign, and we think about it. Lisa Stone is going to be writing in an upcoming publication that should be out in September, and she was one of the first, so she worked with Carl Hammer, one of the first commercial representation of Eugene von Birkenheim in the 80s, and so she'll be talking about towers and towers of possibility. Brett Littman from the Drawing Center will be revisiting his understanding of Eugene's plant theories. Michelle Grabner will be talking about innovation and invention in Eugene's paintings. And I'll be talking about love between Marie and Eugene. And we continue to do the work. We are photographing our entire collection. We are setting out a conservation path. And we continue to answer that call as though we were not a collecting institution. As you can see, we continue to collect and make sure that we have some representation of this work that may not be yet valued by the larger public. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Karen. And now Marion is going to talk about Morton Bartlett's work.
Good evening. You have to tell me how to start. I need to lose yours and go and lovely. That's it, right? And
One
then
more.
this is the first, no?
There.
Okay, and then we just go. Yep. Okay, now we can start. So this was how I actually found Morton Bartlett's work. As extraordinary as it's turned out to be, I found it in quite an ordinary way. It was the Pier Show in New York in 1993, and it was a booth of doll parts. As you can see, they weren't really assembled, some with heads, some without, heads just at random, and it was a bit scary for a lot of people. In fact, they wanted the booth to be disassembled before the show opened, because it was so alarming. Luckily it wasn't, and when I saw it, and I wasn't the first one to see it, I wasn't even that early at the show. It was one of the few shows where I came in very relaxed and a bit late, and I just knew I had to have it all. I wasn't sure why. I couldn't even see everything there was. It was pre-mobile phone, so luckily we have this photo. And I bought it from Bruce Eamond, and I think he was so pleased to be able to wrap it up that after I bought it, he put everything back in boxes, and the sign booth sold out. So really, all I could see was boxes and boxes and boxes, parts of dolls. I didn't even know there were photographs. Then the next stage, obviously, was to take it back to Connecticut, and we did everything there. And then this is, you can see what happened when we assembled it. This was the first doll that you saw, but with its head. And it's important to know that Bartlett very seldom photographed the dolls naked. He actually made the dolls in order to dress them, and he dressed them in order to photograph them. So his end goal was the photographs. And when we bought them, the dolls were actually in individual boxes, almost like coffins. Once he'd made the dolls, they were wrapped up in their 1963 newspapers. He didn't have a need for them. It was the photographs that became his reality, which is really an amazing thought. This is another one, but these are our photos. He didn't photograph them in color, but it gives you an idea of the quality. And as we went through and realized what we had, and there was a lot of negativity about it. But having children myself, I thought anybody who made clothes with such attention to detail like this, they can't really be thinking dark thoughts as well. And there was a lot of talk about that because there were dolls, and it turns out dolls scare people. This gives you an example of his methods. So it was a lot. My husband's a dentist, and I don't think I could have reassembled them all without his help, because the attention to detail, the color, no one arm would fit another doll. Each head was interchangeable, but only in a very certain way. It actually took us 2 years to go through everything we had and catalog it, and then also make a catalog. But this gives you an idea how you put the teeth in from behind. On the bottom there is an armature, which is how he would connect the dolls. So he made the molds, he made everything, including altering the wigs. This gives you an example of all the ears that he would do to see which one would fit which doll. Nothing was random. And then this is the completed one. And this is a good example, the standing child, who I think is particularly beautiful. And this is the one that's now in the collection of the Folk Art Museum. She only has one arm, but not because what's lost or by chance. She was always made to be standing against a wall. She's not necessarily in that photo, but there was no need for the arm to be seen. And what I think is very important to know is that Bartlett never made anything that didn't need to work in a photograph, underscoring that the photographs were his reality. So if they didn't need an arm for the photograph, there was no arm. And then we started to find the photographs. And you can see here how the same child, the same doll, is photographed in different positions. There was 15 dolls in total, 12 girls, 3 boys, and each of them had about 10 outfits, all of which he made. Good examples you can see here. There's another example, the same doll, but with different clothes made just for this doll. The clothes weren't interchangeable. 3 boys, and people seem to think that they might be him because it's a 7-year-old boy, and this is when he was adopted. And the boys are all very similar. This is the other boy. And this is Morton Bartlett. So this is him at Harvard in 1932. And when we bought everything, there was only 2 clues to start the research. With all the boxes and clothes and heads and arms and ears and legs and feet, there was a Harvard yearbook of 1932 and a Yankee magazine of 1962. And that was the only source information we had. So I started with the Harvard yearbook, and remembering that at university, usually you'd sit near people with the same name. So I looked at Bartlett, and it was next to Beale. And I started researching that, and it turned out that they were friends, and Morton Bartlett was the godfather to Mr. Beale's daughter. He had no children of his own. So Patricia Beale was one of the first people that I contacted in the Boston area, and she's the one that told me he carried the photographs with him. And this is how we began to realize that the photographs were his reality. This is where he lived, in Lafayette Street, in Back Bay, I believe it is, in Boston. And the house had already been sold when we were there, but there was a decal on the window for children's charities. And he did leave all the proceeds of the house to children's charities. He had no family. So as our research continued, even though it was coupled with a lot of criticism from a lot of places, which I'll show you later, I became more and more convinced that this wasn't some dark secret thing. It was private, but it wasn't secret. So then we came back home again and realized we really had to do a catalogue and just show the extent of the work. This gives you an idea here. There was drawings for the clothes, and we only found these well into our 2-year search. We're right at the bottom of one of the boxes. And these photos, which are studio shots, he never actually had naked photos that he carried with him. They were the dress children. This was, I think, his studio shot to decide exactly what to do. But it's one of the most fascinating things for me is that they were so perfect and really immaculate in every way, but they were made to be clothed. So in the photographs, nobody could see just how perfect they were. And this is, again, not his photo. This is our photograph, just to show you the quality of the sculpture. And then this is his photograph of the same child. So it doesn't need to be so perfect underneath, but it is. And you can see how the arms are interchangeable. The arms would come off so he could change the clothes, and the heads were interchangeable, but the body and legs were all one, because he didn't need that to be movable. And then we, in the process of literally cataloguing the work, we decided to do a catalogue, and Family Found is what we called it, because it was his family, and it was a family that was found, so it seemed a good way. And we had different aspects of people's interpretations. Museum curator, that was Lee Cogan, Graham Ovenden, who was an expert in dolls, and the catalogue is sold very well, and it's still of interest to a lot of people. And then we decided to show the work. We still hadn't shown it. So we'd done 2 years of research, done the catalogue, and then when we showed it, it wasn't really met with that much approval, as you can see. New York Magazine said, but is it art? And of course, Bartlett never looked at a child like that, as far as we know. He never even photographed them naked. But this is what it was. It was a 6-page article, huge publicity. We sold out of the catalogues, but we didn't necessarily sell much of the work because it was so negative. And then New York Times was very kind to us, but is it art? And they took the exact opposite tack, saying, that there was no scandal. And Vivian Rayner compared it to Prinzhorn, and it was too opposite. And I think the same opposite opinions still exist about Bartlett. Is it dark or is it beautiful? And of course, all good art is push and pull, and perhaps it's a little bit of each. And by now, of course, and this is a few years ago, they had all sold. So we did edition prints, which is what you can see here. But the background is actually a wallpaper that we also had produced, not for sale, but to show the original scale of the photographs, which were in fact quite small. They're about 3 by 5 inches. And then we did edition prints. These are, I think, 8 by 10, something like that. And we also did 22 by 17. So this gives you an idea of the scale of the edition prints and the number of the original photos, which were about 200 in total. And now some of the vintage prints are coming back on the market now, on the secondary market, and we do have some at the fair. And we have the edition prints too. And hopefully the story will continue in some way. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, Tom is going to discuss Dan Miller and also Judith Scott, right?
Judith Scott, Dan Miller,
Yep.
or one or the other. Let's see. Or both, or neither. If I can, I live in San Francisco, so if I can't figure out this Mac, I'm going to really embarrass myself. Here we go. Okay. So, welcome. I'm a native New Yorker, so if I speak too fast, just let me know. Let's see. How come my image isn't coming up? There we go. So I'm going to a little bit of a different direction maybe, because Creative Growth doesn't discover artists. We're an artist. We're a center for artists with developmental disabilities. So if you think about a woman sits in an institution for 40 years, deaf with Down syndrome, and she's isolated from her family and society, how does she come to have a one-woman show at the Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum? And if you think about a young man on the autistic spectrum who's scribbling in an after-school program, how does he become the first man with autism to have his work purchased by MoMA here in New York? And if you look at an early photograph from Creative Growth, how do we move these people towards being contemporary artists? And what was needed to advance and what is needed to advance their aesthetic development, their income, and their recognition? Who can support them with materials, studio space, gallery representation for 10 years, for 20 years, for 40 years, for 44 years? This is Creative Growth now. Creative Growth, so we don't discover artists. We provide an environment for them to grow. And it's part of the plan. So if you come to Creative Growth, you accept the plan and you agree to certain things. You agree that you're going to try to make a commitment to attend, and that we will provide you materials and support for the rest of your life as long as you want that. And that, and do people advance? Yes, they almost always do. And we'll exhibit and sell your work. It's part of the plan. And if you will receive half of the proceeds of anything that is sold and made. And we'll even pay you if you don't sell anything. We were founded by hippies in San Francisco, post-1969 Summer of Love, so you're getting the vibe. So in exchange, there's always a deal with the devil. In exchange, Creative Growth will own the copyright for any work that you make within our building, and you will agree to allow us, unless you don't want it shown, to move forward and represent you in a commercial marketplace. And that is done contractually with the artist and their family or family representative from day one. So if we look at the studio and those folks sitting there, I don't know if they became famous artists, maybe they did, but the contract is the same. So it's not when you get to be successful, it's from day one. So many of the questions we have today on the panel about an artist's development, stewardship, bringing work to market, pricing, working with estates and families, I think could be told by looking at a Creative Growth artist like Dan Miller or Judith Scott. I'll talk a little bit about Judith Scott because her story is most compelling. Maybe many of you know it. So Judith was born in Ohio as a twin. She had Down syndrome. Became deaf at a very early age from a fever. And it wasn't known that she was deaf. So the girls grow up together until age 6, and then on the advice of a doctor, she's taken out of the bed in the middle of the night and institutionalized. 40 years later, her twin sister has this remembrance of her sister and goes back to Ohio and gets her out of the institution and brings her to Creative Growth. And there, as part of the plan, she can stay there forever. So she sits in the studio for about 2 years, really not making work, before she begins a sort of decades-long sculptural project of acquiring, bundling, entombing, wrapping, found, appropriated, stolen objects into sculptures that have sort of, striking visual qualities. Here you see armatures of the work, and her textures not really wrapped as much as woven and triangulated often form. What have come to be seen is a particular interesting form. And sculpture isn't so common in outsider work, even though Marion, we have other sculptural, and we all have sculpture. It's all sculpture. It's bone chairs and dolls and sculpture. Excellent. So Judith is doing this work, and how does she advance from there? So 16 years ago, when I became the director of creative growth, one of my first assignments was from the board was there's this woman doing the stuff that we think is interesting. Maybe you should do something with it. So creative growth sought, like-minded individuals and institutions to come and look at her work. And primary to them was the art historian John McGregor, who had just finished his work on Henry Darger, who came. He lived in San Francisco, and he came over and visited. And we invited him to write the first book on her work, which he did. So that started this is Frieze Art Fair on Randall's Island 3 years ago. So that started the first understanding of her work and the first few relatively small but significant exhibitions. So after that, I invited Lucienne Perry to come to Oakland. Lucienne, at the time, was the director of the Art Brut collection in Lausanne, as many of you know. And she came and she met Judith and she watched her work for quite a while, 7 or 8 days, and thought about her work and her process, and decided to have a major exhibition, 50 pieces of sculpture in Lausanne of her work. So that brought it to a whole kind of another level. So, of course, as the work increases in recognition, the prices tend to go up as well. The first major exhibition we did of her work, when I started at Creative Growth, her sculptures were $225. When the first major exhibition we did of her work was at Rico Maresca Gallery here in New York. That was almost 8 or 9 years ago, or more, I think 10. And it was really important to understand that we didn't just put work in a gallery with a price on it, but it followed many years of study and understanding and of her aesthetic development and really her work kind of coming to be. But over time, of course, the prices go up, and particularly so after her death several years ago. So what happens when she died? We made an agreement with her twin sister Joyce that sales and proceeds from the work would benefit the restoration, the renovation of the Creative Growth building, the facilities, which was ongoing at the time, and that future sales would continue to support the artists in the studio. And we made gifts of sculptures to Joyce and her daughters and immediate family. And that continues. And I think it's important to know, because we're a little bit different, and I hear about it, is that Creative Growth acts as both a studio and a gallery for its artists. And it's a lifelong commitment. But it's really important to know that no staff person at Creative Growth benefits from the sale of art. That staff salaries are all paid for by donated income, that's separate from sales income, and that the artist gets half of the sales income, and the other half of the sales income goes into very consciously supporting the other studio activities. We have 163 artists in the building, so it kind of costs a lot of money to keep them all going for life, which is what we want. And we also don't make any commissions when we sell work. This is her work. Yukiko Koida is here, and Yukiko organized this at the Ginza collection in Tokyo, and that was one of the first exhibitions major of her work in 2001. Still looks great. And I remember the exhibition curator at the time saying that he had seen this old film of Genevieve Bujold called Coma, where they're running through a freezer and bodies are swinging, and that inspired him for this installation, which remains one of my favorites. And this is her work last year at the Sackler Center and Brooklyn Museum, which is an exhibition that started there, organized by Catherine Morris, who might be here tonight, and continues to travel. It went to Aspen Art Museum, Toronto, and it's heading to 2 stops in Europe next year. And this is the Creative Growth Gallery. I just want to make my last note is that, why do we all we're here probably because we find outsider work and so-called outsider work very compelling. And why is that? And I think an interesting question is that part of why we find it so interesting is in contradiction to a lot of the things that we're going to talk about tonight, or are talking about tonight, which is commerciality, pricing, market, artist intention. So this duality is interesting. And I think, the outsider artist goal is not a commercial goal. And it's a process-based activity that speaks directly to human expression and to communication. I hope and think and feel that creative growth strives to preserve this artistic tradition of the artists working independently by having them be in this sort of rarefied, privileged environment of being the artist without marketing concerns, while also receiving representation and marketing on their behalf. So the idea of people with disabilities who are not privileged in society having this opportunity to live in this little bubble is a pretty compelling one for me. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, now we're gonna just have a brief discussion and then open for questions, because I know we're kind of running a little late. If anybody feels the need to rush their dinner plans, we're not gonna judge you. We'll look at you, but so we've heard a lot. I mean, basically, the things that we've heard from all of you are stories about these artists and about their lives. And these are stories that are, of course, like incredibly compelling. But sort of one of my first questions coming off of the telling of these stories is, why do you think we feel the need to tell and retell the stories of the lives of all of these outsider artists' work, as opposed to, say, focusing on the work itself? I mean, this is something you almost never hear unless they've died and there's a sort of compendious biography written of them. The story of contemporary artists' lives. It's always contextualized in terms of art history or what have you. And I was wondering, just sort of what your thoughts on that was. Anyway, anyone who wants to start? Yeah.
Sure, I'll jump in on that. I always like to say that the work leads our discussion, and if you're interested in what you're seeing, then the artist biography comes after that. But I think, of course I think about that all the time, and I think, the idea that I'm coming to around it is we're interested in the stories of the people's lives because the artists are interested in telling us the story of their life. And there's something, we've seen in all of these three artists today that who they are as people is what they're sort of almost dying to express to us, and it comes out that way. And that's not always true, or there's more barriers to that often in how an academic artist might present their own life story.
Sure.
That's true, but funny enough, with Bartlett, almost the opposite happened. When we started the research and went to Boston, in addition to the goddaughter, we got to know his neighbors, who were the Gibrans, Khalil Gibran, actually the nephew of the philosopher, and he was a sculptor. And we assumed there was this very deep story. Why were the dolls? He started with babies, then they got older. And we also know, because of they were very good friends, because of Khalil Gibran, that although it was private, it wasn't a secret. They were there for display in his house. And that's why the article was written for his goddaughter in Yankee magazine. So we, in our mind, were making up the story ourselves. What was this? Babies, teenagers? Then he suddenly stopped with the teenager? There has to be a story. So they were very, very good friends, the Gibrans and Morton Bartlett. He never married, but was very close with them. And there is actually a short film online you can see that, well, you'll see this quotation by the Gibrans. And we said, so why do you think he stopped? And of course, our minds were making the story. And he looked at us and he said, well, he was finished. So I'm not sure if we need the story or there is a story. That still resonates. That was, 25 years ago. And the Gibrans thought we were making up some story that wasn't there.
And I think, speaking from a museum field, as a curator in a public museum, I'm aware that the viewer completes the experience. The artist presents the work and the viewer completes it, in my mind, and without any story. And I don't necessarily feel that it's relegated to self-taught work. I think I'm equally interested to know why James Turrell works with light, and I want to know that. I want to make the work matter, and I want to make the work resonate with our viewer. And I think if we're thinking about artists as a mirror to us as a society, I think we are compelled to understand the work of self-taught art because we are complicated people. And I think the more we know, the more we see reflected in the complicated existence of artists, the more we feel ourselves,
Yeah.
you know? I think that's part of it.
And I think sort of like an interesting piggyback off of this conversation is that, like, Tom, when you talk about the artists that you guys work with, you tend to avoid the term outsider, and Morton Bartlett was an outsider. Presumably, but he went to Exeter, he went to Harvard. I mean, you can't get much more insider. He was, insider than that. And Eugene von Brinchenheim was not unaware of the art world, and in fact, from recordings that I've heard, has strived to be a part of it. He just was unaware of channels of access. So, I mean, I was wondering if you guys could address this sort of this category of outsider even, and what it means to you, and if it is useful or if it's actually detracts from an understanding of the work. I don't know if anybody, you seem to be particularly wanting to jump in on that.
Well, look, also because I'm a DA, I've given this so much thought and been asked it so many times. And I think the best definition for me is one that Roger Cardinal gave me, who of course is the prince of the field in so many ways and such a scholar. And his definition is art that is made not in order to be sold. So it's the lack of commercialism, and it's made for other reasons. Now, obviously, it ends up getting sold and very often becomes very commercial. But if it's not made for commercial reasons, I think that has to be a thread that runs through it.
But Eugene von Brinchenheim really wanted to sell his work, didn't he?
That's right, and he was also had applied for an NEA grant. He was aware of the mechanisms that were available to artists. I think certainly he wasn't successful in his time, but I think I'm pretty lucky that I work at the Kohler where I don't have to give a term for it to be validated. I have to contextualize it for our visitors and for our readers in beyond a label, because that doesn't resonate with anybody. But I guess I'm hyper aware of who's giving labels. So, yeah.
Maybe that's the problem, right?
And I don't use the word outsider in relation to our artists because for people, particularly with developmental disabilities, they've been marginalized and pushed out so much that they don't need another label like that. If there is a definition of outsider, the spirit of outsider that I like, it's for the artist who kind of creates or crafts a world that's so real that they expect to live in it. And I think we see a lot of that here.
That's lovely.
So, I mean, sort of actually wanted to direct a question to you to start a little bit of a segue into the market, since we are, doing a panel for the art fair. And, Marion, you had said that your definition of the outsider is someone who's not making work that is to go to market. But, I was just rereading today the excellent New York Times Magazine article on creative growth. And one of the really interesting things that I found in there was, some of your artists end up being aware that, that their work is being sold, and that perhaps that it's selling well, and even that they're making, a good amount of money. I wanted to talk to you maybe about, like, do you think that affects the way that the work is made? Are you concerned about, I don't know, influencing their creative process, or is that, is that just a part of treating these people as if they were any other type of contemporary?
Sure, I think about it about 117,000 times a day.
Sure.
And and we just really take a lot of care in terms of keeping the studio private, protected environment, and keep, for most of our folks, the difference between and we pay all the artists when we pay the artists. So everyone gets a check. So it's really not so much about what you've sold or how much you're earning. It's really about, there's something about the collective spirit here that we all earned a little something. So that really takes so there's no, it's non-competitive, and it really takes the earnings thing down a notch. The greatest sense of recognition or achievement for a creative growth artist in our home gallery in Oakland is when there's a red dot next to something that they have on the wall because they feel like somebody likes them, or they did something right. And that's a feeling that we promote, that we think is positive. And it's really that, the awareness of money for some of our folks, like Dan Miller doesn't use cash. He lives in a kind of rarefied environment where we provide transportation, and he's not independent. And we work with his sister around his money, and same with Judah Scott. I don't think he's ever had money in his pocket. So he doesn't have an awareness of that. His sister has an awareness of that. Judith didn't have an awareness of that. Her sister had an awareness of that. So for most of our folks like that, hopefully they're still outside of the marketplace enough that their work is. And the example I always use is, if somebody says, that big red Danville, I'm still dreaming of it. Can you ask him to make another one? You can't. I could, but it wouldn't happen. So,
Right.
There's not that. He doesn't have to have the conflict that a contemporary artist would around, all those blue paintings were so successful. Should I do that again?
Yeah.
And let's say one more thing. I think another way to think about it is outside the mainstream. And you can be outside the mainstream because you're completely non-commercial, or because you're disabled in some way and you're able to bring that out. You can be obsessive, which I think is what Bartlett falls into. There's different ways of being outside the mainstream, and it doesn't have to be just one thing.
Sure. You brought up working with artists' families, which I think is also kind of an interesting thing. And is there I guess we'll bring it back to Karen for a second. Was there a lot of interaction between the Art Center and Marie, for example, or do you know how that relationship was handled?
I don't know how that was particularly handled, but I do think that the goal in the acquisition of the work was to take care of Marie in her final years.
Sure,
So
yeah.
I think the family is set up an estate for her in that way. But
It was my understanding actually the police officer whose name I forget now brought the work to the museum actually expressly to help with her. Yeah, because she was quite destitute at that point.
that's right.
Yeah.
So I think, I don't know about the who told what, but I do think that the goal of the acquisition from the Art Center was explicit for the estate to enable Marie to be comfortable.
Yeah, and presumably that happened.
Yeah.
And Bartlett had no family, so you had no.
No, we did find one aunt who lived in Florida, and she was thrilled that we had found the work. She didn't really know about it, and she wanted to organize the show in Florida. She never quite did, and then she died. But that was the only family that we ever came across. If anything, the Gibrans were his family. He spoke to them every day. They probably knew more about him than anybody else. And in the catalogue, we talk about other people in his life. He had a handyman. His other behaviors were obsessive as well. He'd have a sherry at exactly the same time every day.
Oh, right, I remember reading that.
So the obsessive part is what was appealing. But no, he didn't have a family. And the goddaughter was the other nearest thing, who was Patricia Beals, and that's how we found most of our information.
I see. Yeah. And so,
Family Day at Creative Growth is a pretty amazing day. So we have 163 artists and their families. Most of our younger people know their family. Most of our older adults don't. That's just a generational shift around institutionalization. But the thing that we interact with the families around a lot is, if you're a person with a disability, in California at least, if you earn more than a couple $100s a month, you lose all your social services, your transportation, your health care, your housing allotments. So we really have to work with families to decide how they want the artist to receive the money. So we have essentially 163 different plans for everyone. Some take it so much a month for, and we bank and account for what they have. Some people donate it back. Some people, you can't put it in a special needs trust if it was earned by the person. So we interact a lot through those kinds of situations.
It's awfully complicated, isn't it?
Keeps us busy.
I think sort of the last question I had for you guys before we open it up to the audience is sort of like, how do you think about I know that Tom, at least in your case, there are some artists who you can interact with and who do have like a verbal understanding of what it is that they're doing, but in the case of someone like Judith Scott, she was not really able, I guess, to express what it was that she was doing. But then in both of your cases, you were dealing with artists who were dead when you got the work. So I just wanted to talk to you about how you think about or how you contextualize work that you might not, that maybe you might not understand, or you might not have any information from the artist about. I mean, is that, how do you deal with that?
Well, I think in the specific case of Eugene, he wrote a lot himself, and we have evidence of his thoughts, of his own practice that we are able to reference, which is a gift, but I understand that that's not always the case. Right. Certainly, it's not unusual for art historians or curators to write about artists who have passed away. I think that, that is the interpretation, that is the work, that is what keeps the museums going. I think interpretation is an important tool to keep that connection going. Yeah. So, yes, there are mistakes along the way, and there are risks that you have to be willing to take in interpreting the work, but I think that's the good work. That's the work of, that's the job. And so it is a daunting task, certainly, but it's the job. Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah.
I mean, go ahead.
In Bartlett's case, we had clues, because we had Patricia Beals. We also had, it wasn't much source material, but it was full of information. The Yankee Magazine article, where he described it. In fact, he wrote a letter to Yankee Magazine saying, "What a lovely warm title, The Sweethearts of Mr. Bartlett." It wasn't his title, and he was delighted that they called it that. Yeah. So, and then also we have in his Harvard yearbook his own quotation of saying, "I have a hobby which allows me to express my feelings I couldn't otherwise express." So I think we can know is where fantasy and reality overlap. And maybe that's what makes it so interesting.
Yeah. Just as a quick elaboration on that, I remember reading a quote from him that I think was maybe in somebody else's yearbook or something. It was mentioned in the New York Magazine article where it was his yearbook, yes. Where he said that he was trying to pare away conceptual thinking from his art making. Is this something you're...
That article was very unkind.
very unkind and possibly not accurate.
Inaccurate, but I don't even remember that part of it. But no, but he
possibly inaccurate.
We do know he was able to say in his Harvard yearbook biography. It couldn't go out to any more people than that. Yeah. Who knew him, that he was expressing feelings that he otherwise couldn't express. And they were dolls, they weren't children. So a lot of the criticism, it was as if they were children. Yeah.
I don't know how to say this so it doesn't sound sarcastic, but to work with, it's going to sound, to work with 100 artists who none of whom have an artist statement is really the most amazing part of the field.
I think that's sarcasm we can all get behind. And I just, so I wanted to open it up for a couple of questions before we get out of here very late. And if anyone had any questions, there's one right there.
I am an independent curator and writer.
Sorry, there's a mic right there. Sorry about that.
I'm an independent curator and writer from Kansas City. I used to be a curator in New York, and you've all told some very nice stories about things that happened. A friend of ours bought the Emery Blagden estate. It's now at Kohler. I've seen some things that go the other way, where I've worked with people who have championed artists who died alone, basically, ill, broke. They got their art. I would curate exhibits and write, and then all of a sudden, the family appears from nowhere. And I talked with lawyers about this, and they would stop copyright of any reproductions. They took the art, that's it, it's gone. And short of having enough money to buy it outright, or being able to work with family members. In some cases, the families are so ashamed of who these people were that they do not want any recognition for them. Is there any recourse?
It's a good question.
I mean, I've seen this happen now again and again, so... Other than
Certainly.
hiring Guido, that's it.
No, I certainly have had that experience too, not with our collection, but certainly with exhibitions that I'm excited about, and then all of a sudden, you know, I can't go any further because the estate is not interested. I have no idea, I guess is my short answer. I think it's a very complicated world of copyright and intellectual property that is still I don't know. I have no idea. I really don't.
What I was told by lawyers, and there was one artist whose estate I was working with, and his best friend had taken care of him, rescued his art, owned, I mean, basically had it all, including images. And when I was writing about it in a quarterly, the editor said, "Do you have, who owns this?" And I said, "Well, it's his best friend, blah, blah." And he said, "Yeah, but does he have family?" And I said,
Right.
"I should have just lied, but I didn't." I said, "Yes, I think he's got a sister somewhere." I said, "Well, I will not publish this unless we get her permission." And she wouldn't give permission, even though she wanted nothing to do with her brother while he was alive. And I did not realize the extent of control that family members can have, even if they
Absolutely,
don't.
and if you buy a painting, you don't get the copyright either, unless you specifically negotiate for it. So it's property. We've worked with all kinds of intellectual property attorneys to come up with the best contract that supports our artists, and because it's difficult for them to earn money directly, our plan is that we own the copyright. It's very clear, and that we give the artists the money back as a gift. Because then it allows us to do things like parcel payments over time and that kind of thing, because as soon as it's owed and you don't pay it on a due date, then you're in default.
Is that in some way why you have the contract signed sort of on day one, so just in case, someone gets incredibly famous and makes an unbelievable amount of money?
Yeah, and most of our folks don't, but it just simplifies it all. Even if it's just little things like, you're doing an invitation for the gallery and there's an image on it.
Yeah.
If we don't have the copyright, we don't have that right to do that unless we have to clear everything, or a photographer comes and takes a picture for a magazine or something. If we don't have copyright to what's in every photograph, it gets very complicated.
Yeah. Do you have any other questions from anyone before we wrap this up? Oh, there's one right here.
What happened to Eugene's house?
That is a good question. What happened to Eugene's house?
From what I understand, it was raised. There was a few. I think the Kohler went in and did the inventory and things like this, and then that's we had a time pressure. Yeah. So, and I think that was in thinking about the history of the art center and those kind of art environments that are due to be raised. I think that's kind of was a cautionary tale that, could you go back and get the house? Of course. We manage 2 sites that are still in situ as an art center now too, and as you learn as you go, there's just no precedence in this field to know that this was going to be what it was going to be, and it felt like the right thing at the time, of course. But would you want to go back and get the house? Of course. Yeah.
Andrew,
Hi.
go on.
I wanted to ask you all, so many of these artists that we are speaking about of outside artists, and particularly the 3 that we're talking about today, to some degree their renown and their so-called validation has come because they've been presented in the contemporary context, so that it's in the Venice Biennale, or at the Hayward Gallery. So I know there's a feeling of you develop sort of a real personal, emotional connection to these artists, almost like you think, well, what would they want when you're planning? And I just sort of thought it'd be interesting to find out how you feel about these artists who made this work with absolutely no knowledge or no real contact with the greater so-called art world, and now to some degree their renown has come through their being compared, and contextualized by powerful and visionary curators and museums, institutions like this one. And I was just curious to know how you think about that, and if it affects how you present the work and talk about it.
I think particularly for the work in our collection, I'm delighted. You know, I think it's important. I think about our collection as having a social life. And if Levi Fisher Ames goes from small town Wisconsin to the new museum, I think that's fantastic. I think that's ideal, that brings in new insights. You know, I think to control how an artist is discussed is dangerous territory. I think that removes that gut reaction that you have. It feels like you can't talk about it again. So I feel that, you know, and certainly as I think about that as a curator, I'm open to that. I'm open to that risk all the time, not for the safety, but for the interpretation. I think that, you know, I think having a house museum background, you always kind of talk about this period of significance and when you're going to go back to that period of significance, but even that field is changing, that the period of significance is now. And I think that's, you have to make sure that to remember who we are, we have to make people contextualize who we were with who we are now. And so I'm not that protective of it, I don't think. And I think, but I think that I understand the protective nature of it. I think for a long time in the field, there could be some dangerous territory that all of a sudden it would be romanticized, or it could be discussed in this kind of, you know, looking down upon something. And I think we have to, and I can understand why there was a protection at some point, but I do feel there's just, you're right, more curators, more people coming in and trying it out and doing some good things, that I'm all for it, to be honest. Yeah.
In a way, I think there's a more simple answer, that every artist wants affirmation.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really matter the context of it. If people are appreciating their work, and we know this from Morton Bartlett because he kept copies of the letters that were sent to him in response to the Yankee Magazine article. This is another example. This is an obsessive personality. He'd keep the letters, he'd write back to them, and he'd keep copies of these letters. Another indication that it was private but not secret. And all the letters were, "Thank you so much. What a lovely message you sent. And do you remember we used to see each other in Wiscasset," or wherever they would see each other. And it was an affirmation. And I can't imagine there isn't an artist that doesn't want that affirmation in some way.
And I think for me, because I work with our artists and they're living people in a studio, so why wouldn't they be contemporary? So that's a little bit of a different situation, because we have that ongoing relationship. And you know, Judith Scott's shown here. Was in the Rosemary Truckle exhibition. I think that's phenomenal, and that's something that we aspire to. And actually, Andrew, when we're at the Outsider Art Fairs here in Paris, the only thing we do that has the Outsider name on it. Other than that, we do mostly contemporary.
I think we maybe have time for one more, and then we can call it a night if anybody has one more. Oh, Ellen, yeah, hi.
I was just curious. Oh, hi. Whoa, hello. Okay, technology here. I was just curious about the diverse range of choices in materials. So for Martin Bartlett, as a photographer, I'm a photographer. So anyway, the black and white 4x5, that was expensive for him to do in his home, to have those built, the sculptures, and you know, photograph those. I think those were 4x5, if I'm correct. And you know, sort of he was a self-taught photographer. And then, you know, you have paintings and twine. So I'm just curious about materials have meaning. You know, if we look at Pollock or Donald Judd or Eva Hess or somebody like that. And I'm just curious about the choices of those, if that was ever something that was looked at, you know, in the context. I mean, Eugene, I know his photographs really well and his paintings from Frank Maresca. I looked at those over 20 years ago, and they're very sophisticated artworks as objects. I mean, these are not objects that are, I would say, simple. You know, when you look at the objects, Eugene's work or Morton Bartlett's or any, they're very sophisticated objects of the highest caliber. So I'm just curious about their choice in materials. If they were just sort of ready-made or grab and go or.
No, I mean, I think for Eugene and for many of the artists in our collection, it's almost kind of material culture. It's what's around them. It's what they can get access to, whether it's the digging in the construction site to make the pottery or the chicken bones or the painting or the film. It was just what was available, and you're right. It's that the transformation of what was available is where we get really interested. Yeah, but I think I don't think, and this is total interpretation, but I don't think that Eugene saw those as chicken bones. I think he saw them as building blocks or a way to communicate his value to other people. Yeah.
And we know that Morton Bartlett made all the clothes. There was no wastefulness and spending. And in fact, there was lots of bits of ribbons and everything was used that he could. And the wigs were altered. It was all done quite economically. And you saw from the armatures and the image of all the parts, each figure would take him a year. So it was really labor intensive with the clay and the lost wax technique and the molds. It was the labor that was the expense. And really, this is what he didn't need money for anything else except this.
There's a way, I mean, there's a way in which even if you can't speak to the artists, their sort of use of material, their intentionality sort of comes through that. And I think that's maybe a good note to end on. And thank you everybody for coming. And thank you everyone for sitting on this panel. And everybody should come to the Outsider Art Fair because it's going to be great.